The Curbsiders podcast is for entertainment, education, and information purposes only, and the topics discussed should not be used solely to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any diseases or conditions. Furthermore, the views and statements expressed on this podcast are solely those of the host and should not be interpreted to reflect official policy or position of any entity, aside from possibly Cash Like Nora Hospital and affiliate outreach programs, if indeed there are any. In fact, there are none. Pretty much, we aren't responsible if you screw up. You should always do your own homework and let us know when we're wrong.
Well, Paul, I made it here. I didn't know if I was going to make it, Paul. I've been a little under the weather, but we're doing it. This is an episode of Hotcakes, and I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, no, we were talking offline. I'm like, whatever you need to do, take care of yourself. This is the era of self-care. But inside, I was in a blind panic that you weren't going to be here. So I'm glad that you're feeling better, mostly selfishly.
I just couldn't miss this opportunity to hang out with Dr. Rahul Ganatra and Dr. Nora Taranto. This is a fun show for us, Paul. We get to mix it up, act like we know what we're talking about. It's a good time.
Yeah, or I can display my usual ignorance and Rahul can correct, and then we can teach that way too. So everyone wins. Right.
Well, how about you tell the audience what is it we do on this show, and then we can move on to maybe some picks of the week before we get to the articles.
Sure. Happy to, as always. As a reminder, we are the internal medicine podcast, and typically we use expert interviews to bring you clinical pearls and practice-changing knowledge. But as you already alluded to, this is our wildly popular Peabody Award-winning Hotcakes series, where we actually go through journal articles that we thought were neat or interesting or compelling, and try to pick them apart and see if they are useful or not, and then we rate them on a mostly arbitrary hotcake system that I think we've been working on.
And I will remind the audience that this and most of our episodes are available for free CME for all health professionals through VCU Health at curbsiders.vcuhealth.org. Now with that, let's go to our good friend, Dr. Nora Taranto, for a pick of the week.
What's up, y'all? Glad to be here with you guys. I have I've been watching a lot of TV while I studied for Step 3 the last few weeks. So I have so many possible picks of the week, but my latest one is the Netflix series Cheer, which I don't know whether any of you guys have watched, but the second season just came out, and it's a documentary series about several junior college cheerleading teams that are national champions. It's really, really compelling. The characters are fascinating. And it also taught me a lot about a sport that I know very, very little about. Kind of like Friday Night Lights, but in a very different way. And both take place in Texas. So that's my pick of the week.
I believe our good friend Dr. Leah Witt has recommended that the first season when that came out. And I saw the trailer for that show. It's probably not for me, but it looks interesting.
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of people said that, including myself. And I think my dad actually initially really was not interested. And then I had it on, and it's really interesting.
Okay. Well, if it's good enough for your father, then it's, exactly. Maybe I should check it out.
He watches a lot of TV too, so.
All right. Rahul, how about you?
I've realized that I have a lot of imposterism regarding my picks of the week, because everyone else always has these really fascinating, like, bohemian things, especially Paul, that belie this life of intrigue, and I always have like cookies. But I feel like I finally have something this week.
Is it cookies?
Yeah, no, it's not cookies. Although maybe I should do that for next week. No, do people know what yak tracks are?
I do not know. Is it? I thought it sounded like an ice cream, like Moose Tracks ice cream or something. I don't know. It's an off-brand Moose Tracks ice cream.
Off-brand Moose Tracks. No, something much better. Yak tracks are flexible, like, cleats that you can attach to your shoes for any activity kind of out in the ice and snow, walking, running, hiking, and they work surprisingly well. I got a pair as a holiday gift from my wife, and I have used them to run with confidence on like fresh ice, and they totally work. I'm a big enthusiast now. Yak tracks for all your winter running
that
needs.
Is a hot tip there. Thank you, Rahul. I've broken my ankle running on the ice in your city, Boston. That was 20 years ago, but I could have used those back then. All right. Well, we wanted you to go. That was a great pick. We should go before. I'm letting you go before Paul, because last time you had so much anxiety going after him. Paul, what's your pick of the week?
No, I mean, mine's an easy one. This was an underhand pitch. It was like, so someone went and laid out catnip for me. So I'm going to recommend The Tragedy of Macbeth. The film that just came out is on, I think, Apple TV, directed by Joel Coen. So one of the first movies that he's done without his brother Ethan, starring Denzel Washington, Frances McDormand, using the words of William Shakespeare, who apparently can write. And it's a masterpiece. Like, Denzel can act, like, the water's wet and the sky is blue, but like his performance is remarkable. The entire thing is shot in black and white and is like stark and surreal and kind of almost like German expressionist movie. It's just beautiful to look at. The score is incredible. The fact that the leads are a little bit older than we typically cast lends this sense of urgency and actually kind of twists the plot a little bit around and kind of just changes motivations in a way that's super interesting. It has everybody, like Brendan Gleeson. There's like a 2-minute amazing bit by Stephen Root, the character actor. So it was just a movie that I absolutely loved. Not surprisingly, I went into it wanting to love it, and I was happy to. So if that sounds up your alley, I cannot recommend it highly enough. The Tragedy of Macbeth.
Just remarkable, Paul. Just remarkable. These are off the cuff, people. He's not reading from a note card there.
This is all scripted. I haven't read my article, but I've written all this down.
So Paul, call back to a previous show. So this is from the email. Listener Jody Marks, nurse practitioner, said he sent us an email. I didn't realize that milk and molasses enemas might be a regional thing. I'm in Alabama, and it's a pretty common thing here. I will say that from a nursing point of view, it makes the whole experience much more pleasant because the molasses covers the poo odor quite well. I would not recommend it if you plan on consuming molasses at any point thereafter, though. It pretty well ruins the experience for life. So thank you, Jody, for confirming that the milk and molasses is the preferred enema, at least in Alabama. This episode of the Curbsiders is brought to you by Grammarly Premium. Curbsiders, we've been using Grammarly for over a year now, and there's a reason for that. Paul, he struggles with the tone of his emails. He doesn't want to sound angry, and Grammarly can help him with that. And me, well, I've said it before, I don't really understand commas. Grammarly is an AI-powered writing assistant that helps me write clearly and mistake-free so I can feel good about my written communication. At the Curbsiders, we're putting out weekly show notes, we have blog posts, we're constantly emailing with guests and listeners, and we want to make sure that we're doing a good job with our written communication. And with Grammarly, it helps us in many ways. One of those ways is it helps us simplify things. Grammarly will actually suggest whole sentence rewrites because sometimes I say things in a way that just doesn't make any sense. Grammarly also helps me with word choices so I can sound smart with better vocabulary. And Grammarly helps Paul with his tone so that he's not sounding like a grumpy pants when he's sending emails to people. We want you to start your year off right with Grammarly. Our listeners right now can get 20% off Grammarly Premium at Grammarly.com/curb. That's 20% off at GRAMMARLY.com/curb. Grammarly.com/curb.
This episode of the Curbsiders is supported by Green Chef. Green Chef is a meal kit service that makes eating well easy. Whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free, or if you're just looking to eat more balanced meals, Green Chef offers a range of recipes to suit your preferences. With fresh produce, premium proteins, and organic ingredients you can trust, Green Chef is the #1 meal kit for eating well. Green Chef offers 35 nutritious and flavorful options to choose from every week, featuring premium, clean ingredients that are seasonally sourced for peak freshness. Green Chef makes cooking easy so you can spend less time stressing and more time enjoying delicious home-cooked meals. I will say, as someone who really loves cooking, but also as someone who does not have a whole lot of free time, Green Chef has been a real boon. You get these meals that are shipped right to your door. The ingredients are prepackaged and portioned out, so it's just a matter of assembling according to the recipe that's included. It's a way to put together a really thoughtful, delicious meal that feels homemade without all the stress of waiting in line at the grocery store and having to hunt for ingredients. So if that sounds appealing to you, I would encourage you to go to greenchef.com/curb130 and use code curb130 to get $130 off, plus free shipping. Again, that is greenchef.com/curb130 and use code curb130 to get $130 off, plus free shipping. Green Chef, it is the #1 meal kit for eating well.
All right. So with that, Paul, how about you take us into our first article of the evening, and I'll let you introduce it.
Yeah, no, thank you for this smooth transition, Matt. So I I chose for my article an article out of JAMA Cardiology that came out a couple months ago. This is from the iStop Afib trial with Marcus et al. So the full study is Individualized Studies of Triggers of Paroxysmal Atrial Fibrillation, the iStop Afib randomized clinical trial. And I didn't choose it because of the name, which I hate, like all cardiology trial names. But it's the question they were asking is, and we'll get into what this means, but does N of 1 testing of patient-selected atrial fibrillation triggers enhance their atrial fibrillation-associated quality of life? And I picked this because I was fascinated by this N of 1 study design, which is this really patient-centered approach that actually manages the patients to kind of design their own study for themselves and then evaluate the intervention on it. So basically the question is, if you allow patients to do that, does that improve their quality of life related to atrial fibrillation? And then some of the other stuff they looked at is, does some of the exposures that the patients were experimenting with triggering or avoiding, did that actually impact their atrial fibrillation in any kind of way in terms of actually episodes of atrial fibrillation? And then bottom line, and before we sort of get into the more specifics, is that it didn't actually seem to improve the quality of life, which I found interesting because in some instances it actually did reduce episodes of atrial fibrillation. So you would think that those things would naturally follow, but they didn't necessarily. So I'd like to maybe pause there. And since we have Rahul at our disposal, actually just ask him to talk a little bit about this N of 1 study design, because I'd never seen it before, but I think it's such an interesting and individualized way to kind of study a phenomenon.
Absolutely. This is a great example of an N of 1 study. So the problem that an N of 1 study design is meant to address is that in a traditional randomized controlled trial, we can really only estimate the average effect of a treatment in a group of patients. And subgroup analyses can be used to try to drill down a little bit more, like do patients with diabetes or coronary disease respond differently to the treatment? But we really never know how the individual patient in front of us is going to react to a treatment. So the N of 1 study, as Paul was describing, is a really patient-centered alternative to a traditional randomized trial where individual patients are switched multiple times, go through multiple crossovers between either an exposure and lack of an exposure or between two treatments to find out what is the individual treatment effect in that particular patient. And these studies can be blinded, they can be double-blinded. They really work best for diseases that are kind of stable and slow and progressive, okay? And they work best where there's a clear set of symptoms or a biomarker that will kind of indicate success or failure. You obviously can't do this for an outcome that's sort of catastrophic, like an MI or death. And this kind of works.
Get a lot of washout that way.
Exactly. Can't row back from that one. And as you mentioned with washout, this works best for treatments that kind of have a quick onset and a quick offset. So there's kind of a specific place for these studies, but where they can be done, they're a great way to try to estimate what is going to be the individual effect of this treatment in this patient.
Paul, so can you tell us a little bit more about like what it looked like for the individual patients in this study, the design of it?
Yeah, it's as is my way. I think faithful listeners will know I usually pick studies where I don't realize exactly how complicated the design is, and I regret the choice that I've made. So this is complicated but fascinating. So the patients were allowed to choose their own potential trigger for their paroxysmal atrial fibrillation episodes. And the triggers included things like caffeine and alcohol, which were the two most chosen things, but also lack of sleep, exercise, lying on your left side, dehydration. And then they could even sort of pick, there was another column that they could also choose. And over a 6-week period, they then, at 3 of the weeks of that 6-week period, during one of the days, during that 1 week interval, they would choose to expose themselves to the potential trigger. So they would dehydrate themselves or have some beer or drink some coffee or miss sleep or whatever the other was. I should dig deeper to find out what the other was. And then the other 3 weeks, they would avoid those things consciously. And so after that 6-week period where they've had 3 weeks of possible exposures and 3 weeks of avoidance, they would then get this printout of, okay, so here's how much atrial fibrillation you had, and here's whether or not we thought this is actually related to your trigger or not. And then they were given 4 weeks to adjust their behavior. And then they evaluate afterwards as to whether or not this impacted their quality of life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is, like you said, complicated, but it makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, it's because it was a lot of words. But so basically, they expose themselves. That's the wrong way of saying it, but they expose themselves to the trigger. They were avoided things, and then they did fancy. Then statistics ensued. They got a printout of basically whether or not those exposures, like how that impacted their atrial fibrillation, and they were given 4 weeks to adjust their behavior, and then evaluate after that fact. So it was a chance to see. Yes, Dr. Taranto.
Just
Paul, it
thinking
was
of
a
a
great
study
pun.
that involved exposures, kind of as in an N of 1 trial. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul was a great pun.
But yep. Good stuff. So, in any case, and then after they went through this whole rigmarole that for a total of 10 weeks, they were given the opportunity to choose a different exposure and do it all over again up to a total of 3 times. They could actually choose different exposures throughout the course too. So that was the study. Complicated, but interesting.
I wanted to ask Rahul. So I was looking at this, and some of the limitations that I think they even just said in the paper, there was like a relatively high attrition rate, and they weren't wearing continuous EKG monitors. So maybe we missed the treatment effect because there was a lot of patients left the study or they didn't have all the data on them, or they would have picked up more AFib events if they had a continuous monitor on. But can you talk about, was there anything else about the design of this that you thought maybe contributed to this being a negative trial?
Of course. Like you said, there was no difference in the primary outcome, which was measured by the survey instrument, this quality of life questionnaire that patients filled out once a month. And I'll just note that the authors did something interesting. They did a series of individual N of 1 trials, and then they did a meta-analysis to combine all of those individual treatment effects into an average treatment effect. So while it was the case that there was no difference in AFib-related quality of life on average, we have all this data to be able to know whether for individual patients there was a reduction. So this kind of is a flexible way to demonstrate the strengths of this study design. And there were some design features that I think make a negative result more likely. A survey that you fill out once a month is something that's going to be prone to recall bias, so that would affect the precision of the estimate. The intention to treat analysis was really conservative in this study. The authors considered every day during an exposure period where patients were advised to expose themselves to the trigger of interest as having achieved that, which almost assuredly people did not. So in this study, I think the per protocol analysis is actually probably more reflective of what people do in the real world. And there were some important secondary outcomes. They did find that alcohol in the per protocol analysis was associated with AFib associated quality of life, and about 40% fewer atrial fibrillation events occurred during the 4-week period in the entire population. So those are still benefits that you can use information like this to treat your patients. And even though this was a negative study with regard to the primary outcome, I think there are some reasons for that we can understand why.
Paul,
I think a really important takeaway here is that caffeine is once again vindicated, by the way. So even though alcohol was associated with atrial fibrillation, I cannot stress enough caffeine, A-okay.
So Paul, what is how many hotcakes would you give this on a scale of 0 to 5? 5 being the most practice-changing, best designed study.
Yeah, I think I'm going to land on my usual 3, which is not a criticism. It's just it's hard to know quite what to do with this, but I think at least the alcohol part's interesting, and and the caffeine part, of course, is very satisfying. And I thought the design was fascinating and has implications for other trials, and a chance to look at this further. So I'll give it a solid 3.
All right. Next up is the CLICK trial. Nora, do you want to tell us about this one and start off the discussion?
Sure. So the CLICK trial was a trial by Agrawal et al., just published in the New England Journal about a week ago, 2 weeks ago now. And it looked at the use of chlorthalidone as a means of lowering blood pressure in hypertensive patients with advanced kidney disease. And so their question was, is chlorthalidone safe and effective in advanced kidney disease? And this is actually a question that I was very curious the answer to, because anecdotally, I feel like we talk all the time about all the electrolyte derangements that we worry about with chlorthalidone and thiazide diuretics in particular. So overall, the study enrolled 160 individuals, half into the placebo arm and half into the chlorthalidone group. There were dose adjustments every 2 to 4 weeks over the 12 weeks of the study. And so they followed the blood pressures and lab changes over the course of the 12 weeks for those 160 individuals, with visits over that course as well. It was an intention to treat analysis. And overall, it was a positive study. They found a significant decrease in the systolic blood pressures in the chlorthalidone arm compared to the placebo.
This is an exciting trial because we do have an episode coming out, audience, talking about hypertension and how to treat it in CKD. But this was a practice I would have been afraid to give chlorthalidone to anybody with advanced CKD. So exciting to see this. And this was a positive trial. Rahul, what do we need to look out for here to make I always want to be cautious in my interpretation of a positive trial before I just blindly rush into putting this into practice.
This is great. I think what you identified, that this is a sort of proof of concept that you use. Maybe we can use chlorthalidone safely in patients with CKD. I think the study has a lot of value for that reason. But your impulse to look for ways in which the study could be vulnerable to a false positive is really important. And as I'm looking over the design of the study, there's a couple things that stand out to me that could influence that likelihood. One, I'll just note that in the consort diagram in the supplement, it's made clear that only about 5% of patients who were screened were ultimately included, which that in and of itself is not necessarily bad, but it does make you take pause and ask the question, is this kind of a Goldilocks phenomenon of selecting only the exact right patients who are likely to derive benefit from this strategy? And we can talk a little bit more about the adverse effects, but the study population was people with blood pressure over 130/80, but less than 160/100. And we were talking before air, a lot of us care for patients with CKD with blood pressures kind of a lot worse than that. So, I have some concern that the patient population might have been a little highly selected.
I think they were trying to protect, because they were going to be giving placebo. I think they just didn't want to give placebo to somebody with a blood pressure 160/100. But that was my thinking on that, at least the initial exclusion criteria.
I totally agree. I think that's an appropriate decision to ensure that the right patient population where there's uncertainty about the effect are enrolled. And then second, since the authors did identify a relatively large effect size, 10.5 millimeters of mercury, even with a small sample size, more than what they were powered to detect, that does to me suggest that there is very likely a real large effect in this patient population.
Yeah. Paul, what did you think about the people who are on 3.5 drugs at baseline, and then they're adding chlorthalidone as the fourth drug? Are you seeing this in practice?
I'm not. I think it goes back to the point that for whatever the reason, anecdotally, the thiazides were thought to just not great agents. So in terms of it, this is the thing that if you're going to choose a fourth agent to add on, that is not the one I think a lot of folks would think of, at least where I practice, because I think the going theory was that thiazides just aren't helpful once you get past a certain point in kidney disease. So I think this is actually a really exciting and encouraging trial so far to me.
And I like the point you made earlier, off air, that the average systolic blood pressure in the groups was in the 140 range, which is not. I mean, a lot of people would just be like, "Hey, we're doing it." Like they would. A lot of people would leave that go.
Yep.
But the KDIGO guidelines, which were recently released in I believe it was the end of 2021, Paul, it's all blurring together. But the KDIGO guidelines, they're targeting for advanced CKD, CKD4, a blood pressure systolic 120. And even in the treatment group, if you're starting at 140 and you're getting down by 10 points, you're not even quite making it under 130.
Yeah, even though I would be doing cartwheels in the hallway if I got there, but that's
right with 4.5 meds. So it's not easy to get the blood pressure down.
I was impressed that most of this blood pressure improvement in the chlorthalidone group seemed to happen, at least per their report, by kind of within the first month or so and at the lowest dose, which suggests that you may actually not need a ton of it for it to actually be effective, even in folks with advanced kidney disease.
Our sponsor today is Blue Land. Audience, my wife and I love this next sponsor. We've been using Blue Land products for the past few months, and we are just so thrilled with them. And you know what? It's about time that something like this came around, because it's 2022, and it's time to stop wasting water and throwing out more plastic bottles. And that's why you got to get Blue Land's revolutionary refill cleaning system instead. Their idea is simple and beautiful. You buy a bottle once and you refill it forever, so there's no more plastic waste. Just fill a bottle with warm water, Pop in one of the hand soap or spray cleaner tablets, and within minutes, you have powerful cleaning products in some of the most incredible scents. And they even make plastic-free laundry, dishwasher, and toilet cleaner tablets. The other day, my son was in the bathroom, and he's like, "Mom, what is this smell in here? It smells amazing. I love it." And it was the Blue Land toilet cleaner tablet that we had just thrown in there. So try Blue Land today. You're going to love it, and the planet will thank you. Right now, you can get 20% off your first order when you go to blueland.com/curb. That's 20% off your first order of any Blue Land products at blueland.com/curb. blueland.com/curb.
This episode of the Curbsiders is supported by Provider Solutions and Development, expert recruitment advisors with 20 years of experience. Recruitment had to change, so they took away quotas and started listening to clinicians. There are plenty of options when it comes to your career in medicine, but just like every patient is different, each physician has their own personal definition of success. Provider Solutions and Development doesn't bring one answer for all. They are recruitment experts, focusing on who you are before helping you find out where you're meant to be. Whenever your next career move happens, you deserve a job search partner who considers who you are before looking for your next role. Provider Solutions and Development is a group of empathetic recruitment advisors helping physicians like you find the place you really want to be, and it starts by learning what matters most to you. Whatever you're ready for next, they'll help you find it, with no quotas or commissions to get in the way. You can start the conversation today or anytime at info.psdconnect.org/curbsiders. Again, that is info.psdconnect.org/curbsiders.
Nora, what did you think about the conclusions we can draw from this? It was a 12-week trial, and it's targeting just blood pressure lowering, which is, it's a marker, but it's not like a hard clinical endpoint. What did you think about that as far as like, would this change things for you?
Yeah, so it definitely changes to some extent how I think about chlorthalidone as a tool in my toolbox. I'm not sure I'm going to be jumping to put all of my patients with end-stage advanced kidney disease on it yet, just because it had such a short follow-up period. And there were some significant electrolyte abnormalities and adverse events in both groups. There were no significant differences between the placebo and the chlorthalidone arm, but there were increased rates of hypomagnesemia, hypokalemia, and hyperuricemia in the chlorthalidone arm, and we didn't see those in terms of serious adverse events, at least as I can tell, but something to kind of think about. And then longer term, I think we just don't know yet whether or not chlorthalidone, like other antihypertensives that we use in this patient population, ACE, ARBs, beta blockers, whether they confer any cardioprotective or renal protective effect yet.
Can I ask Rahul, the adverse events I'm interested in, because it was something like 91% in the test group and 80 or like 89 in the control or something bananas like that. Like they were both seemed very high, and there were a lot of adverse events listed, and it was all kind of clumped together. So I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. But just looking at the breakdowns, things like acute kidney injury higher in the chlorthalidone group that I don't have the N value in front of me, or some of the electrolyte abnormalities. So I'm just wondering. I might not even know what my specific question is, but is this way of looking at adverse events helpful, I guess, or is there anything that could have been done differently to make this a little bit more meaningful when comparing the two groups, or am I just looking for trouble?
Nope. It's a great question. And there's a design feature of this trial that has some relevance to what you're asking, and that is the use of a run-in period. And what a run-in period is in the beginning of the trial, everybody gets the same treatment, and that can be either placebo or the treatment of interest. And in trials that use a run-in period with the medication of interest, you have to worry that those trials are going to underestimate the true frequency of adverse events, because anybody who can't tolerate the drug is going to drop out of the study before randomization. Okay. So that was fortunately not the case in this study. They used a placebo run-in, and this was for the purpose of medication standardization. And this is a way to increase power, because you are going to minimize the number of people who drop out, because in order to make it through the run-in, and you kind of are proving that you're going to attend study visits. That is to say that if you read a trial with a run-in period that uses the treatment drug, you have to ask the question, is this prone to underestimate adverse events? So because that was not the case here, I sort of feel good about these adverse events as being reflective of chlorthalidone. What we don't know from that table in the paper is at what dose those adverse effects occurred. And I would be interested to know whether patients who experienced hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia were patients who had been titrated all the way up to 50 milligrams a day, or if those phenomena were seen at lower doses as well. So that would be an additional piece that you would want to see from the paper.
I think we should probably wrap it up on this trial. Nora, what are your final take homes from this and your hotcakes rating?
I'm overall excited about it. I think I'm looking forward. They have a longer term follow-up study that's in process now, so I'm cautiously optimistic, which leads to my hotcakes rating of, I think, 4.
Ooh, I am excited at the prospect of using more chlorthalidone, ACEs and ARBs, and things like spironolactone, which our upcoming guest taught us on our high blood pressure episode, Paul, our hypertension FAQ, as we're calling it. Which will come out. So people check that out. That's going to be a great episode to follow up this conversation about the CLICK trial. Let's switch gears a little bit now, Rahul. And can you update us on what's the status of outpatient COVID management? It's beautiful, right? We can easily get lots of great drugs that can help our patients.
Boy, what a setup. No, it's horrible. Everything is in limited supply. You can't find anything you need. No, okay, it's kind of between those two. Okay, so NIH has just updated the guidelines for the treatment of high-risk outpatients with COVID-19. And I know it's hard to stay up to date on the literature with all of this, mainly just because of content fatigue. I think everyone's getting really sick of having to know things about COVID. Paul is nodding vigorously for those of you who can't see what's happening. Okay, so I will briefly regurgitate for you a digested version of those guideline changes. So the NIH now recommends in decreasing order of preference using 4 therapies that have FDA authorization for use in high-risk outpatients. The first treatment that is recommended is Nirmatrelvir ritonavir. The brand name is Paxlovid, and this is an oral antiviral produced by Pfizer. And this is a protease inhibitor that was developed specifically for COVID. So it's a drug that was not a repurposed thing, one of the first that we have. And in a large phase 3 trial that has not yet been published, but data are available through the FDA, this drug was highly effective at reducing hospitalizations and death. And it was also the only agent shown to sort of convincingly stop viral replication and really decrease viral load. The downside is that there are a lot of drug-drug interactions that are really going to limit its use, and I think availability is going to be an ongoing issue with this drug. So if you have access to Nirmatrelvir, ritonavir, or Paxlovid, NIH says that's your first go. The second drug in order of preference is a monoclonal antibody called Cetrovimab, and this is given as a one-time IV infusion. And in some ways that are fortunate, some ways that are unfortunate, the guidelines are now a lot simpler regarding the monoclonal antibodies because none of them work except for Cetrovimab against Omicron. So you don't have to worry about pronouncing the names of the other ones because they don't work anymore.
Yeah, they're moot.
So NIH, they're moot points. NIH now recommends, based on the COMET-ICE trial, which was published in the New England Journal, that you should use Cetrovimab. It's a one-time IV infusion, and this was also shown to have high activity or high efficacy at reducing hospitalizations and death. The downside of Cetrovimab is that being a biologic, it will be vulnerable to supply chain vulnerabilities. A silver lining is that it binds to a highly conserved part of the spike protein, so it's expected that this should retain activity against future variants of concern.
Paul, were you involved in the naming of the COMET-ICE trial? Isn't that one of your side gigs? You're a trial name consultant?
I think I can announce here, I'm really thrilled they responded to all my letters. So, yeah, deeply excited that the team of Gupta liked my idea. Acknowledgements would have been nice, but, you know.
Paul, I don't know if this one also came from you, but the Pine Tree trial.
I hate it so much.
My favorite.
Is one that has been getting some positive press lately. So the Pine Tree trial, also in the New England Journal, this was established remdesivir as the sort of third line recommendation for outpatients for NIH. Our old friend remdesivir, when given to outpatients, was highly effective at reducing hospitalizations. But because there were no deaths in either group in this sort of small study, we don't really know yet if there's any effect on mortality. But basically, this was 3 days of treatment with IV remdesivir among high-risk outpatients. It was effective at reducing both hospitalizations and really any medically attended visit at all. The downside is that it's 3 days of treatment with an IV med, and that may be a little tricky to coordinate, but we already know that it's safe and sort of not really side effects to worry about. The last medication on NIH's list is a drug that has a name that I think is maybe a little undeserving. It's called Malnupiravir. Do people know where the name Malnupiravir comes from?
I believe it's Thor's hammer.
It is Thor's hammer. That's right.
What?
So that kind of, makes you think it would be super effective, but it's more like maybe Thor's Pog Slimer would be a better.
It's like Thor, Endgame
namesake.
Thor, not Thor in whatever, Infinity War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Malnupiravir is recommended only if there are no other options. And this was based on the Move Out trial in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is an oral agent. It's a nucleotide analog taken for 5 days. This was associated with a really small reduction in hospitalizations and death. And in my opinion, I posted a little bit about this on Twitter. This difference could be entirely due to confounding by gender, because about 8% more women by chance ended up in the Malnupiravir group. And we know that men are at higher risk for severe outcomes from COVID-19. And in a secondary analysis, when they controlled for the imbalance in gender, this benefit was completely attenuated. The subgroup analyses also support that the benefit, if any, is likely to be really small. And there are some long-term safety effects about this medication that are really not addressed in this study. So for these reasons, NIH suggests this is only, to be used as a last resort if you don't have access to anything else. So my take-homes from the update to the NIH guidelines is that nirmatrelvir, ritonavir, Cetrovimab, and remdesivir are all highly effective options for preventing progression of COVID-19 in high-risk outpatients. And I'll just add here, all patients in all 4 studies were unvaccinated. So it is totally unknown at this point what the effect of these medications will be, if any, in risk reduction for high-risk vaccinated patients. The efficacy and safety of Malnupiravir are less clear and should really only be used as a last resort, and the choice is sort of dictated by patient factors and availability.
Yeah, so we're going to wrap up this topic. I did want to ask the great Dr. Paul Nelson-Williams, have you been using any of these outpatient treatments? Have you found it hard to get them or confusing as to what to do?
I mean, it's thanks for the setup. A challenge, I think for our transplant patients specifically, the Paxlovid or their nirmatrelvir, ritonavir, the ritonavir parts being the sticking point, was just an absolute nightmare for drug interactions. I've had patients, if you have someone who happens to be on apixaban, or full dose apixaban, or amlodipine, or atorvastatin, or more importantly, your immunosuppressants for transplant. So if you're a transplant patient, so by definition would be at high risk and are on tacrolimus, it just jacks up tacrolimus levels something fierce. So it's a challenging medication to use from a drug interaction standpoint. And then the other agents I've had some limitations on getting a hold of. The remdesivir is interesting. I actually want to ask Rahul, I know we're coming up to closing time, but I haven't looked in great detail at that study, but I can't help but wonder if having the capacity to go someplace 3 days in a row suggests an infrastructure and support system that might favor a healthier patient than might necessarily benefit from that. But I don't know if I'm reading too much into this study or not. But I just feel like you have to have some stuff in place to even be able logistically to manage the remdesivir.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And in that study, about 15% of patients were able to have home infusions of remdesivir coordinated for
terrific.
them. So some places like my branch of Kashlak Northeast, we have a hospital and home program that's been very agile at kind of getting nurses into the patient's home to do the infusion for those really high risk patients who sort of can't do as you suggest to get somewhere 3 times.
Can I ask really quickly, also getting up against the time limit, but fluvoxamine, where in this list do you put that? And are you prescribing it when an outpatient calls in saying they have COVID, kind of relatively regardless of their risk status?
So I'm no content expert on fluvoxamine. I will just note that NIH has not included it as of yet in their clinical guidelines. IDSA does have a recommendation that medications that might have a clinical benefit, should only be used in the context of a clinical trial. And I'll note that David Boulware, who is an infectious disease physician, I think at University of Minnesota, is currently running a sort of patient-driven randomized controlled trial of repurposed therapies, including fluvoxamine. So if you are going to use fluvoxamine for a patient, try your hardest to connect them with a clinical trial so that we can kind of get the evidence to know if they really work.
The doses are really high.
Yeah, they're like 4
But also,
times.
there is some evidence, it's wild to me how it just got memory hold. I think I was talking to a colleague about this in the same way that just because I don't think we have a great mechanism of action that makes sense, we just kind of forget that it exists because I think we're so burned out like ivermectin and some of the other stuff that just doesn't have plausibility that it just doesn't make sense that it should work, even though there seems to be a pretty good trend that it does. So we just forget it exists a lot of the time. So I'll be curious to see where this one goes.
Nora, so the last thing we're going to talk about is a little bit of COVID testing to leave people with that. So take us home.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure many folks can relate to wondering whether their rapid tests are false positives, false negatives, or just real. And so this study was just published in JAMA about a week ago by Gans et al. And looked at the incidence of false positives in rapid antigen tests as confirmed by PCRs later on. And so looked at almost 1 million rapid tests and found that the rate of false positives in antigen testing is quite low, but can happen. Actually, greater than 50% of the false positives they found as confirmed by negative PCRs were from the same batch of a particular company, suggesting that batch testing may be an issue in false positive creation. So Rahul, I'd love to hear your quick takes on what we can actually take away from the study and what it leaves as remaining questions.
Yep. The only thing I would say about this is that anytime you're evaluating a study of a diagnostic test, just think about the possibility of what's called spectrum bias, which is the full spectrum of disease represented in the population under study? And if not, you just have to be careful about applying the results. So this study was really only done among asymptomatic patients, so we can't make inferences about how the false positive rate would generalize to people with symptoms.
All right. Yeah, the home testing, I wish the home testing was working better for Omicron than what it seems to be right now. But that's where we're at with this.
There is, I will say, there's a really nice New England Journal diagram that I found a couple days ago, kind of breaking it down by pretest probability, just as a nice summary of what you might consider doing if you have a positive test and you're not sure whether it's positive based on where you are. I would say we probably all fit into the moderate to high pretest probability right now, just given prevalence. But
all right, so we'll put that link in the show notes. Paul, there's a ACP put out a diverticulitis guideline. I'll shoot that over to you in an email. I know you're like everyone else. They're saying no, antibiotics are not needed. So we don't have to dig into it. Let's get to the outro.
That's just the matzo ball you're going to leave hanging out there?
I'm going to leave it out there.
So listeners at home, do not treat diverticulitis. Anyway, good night, folks. This has been another episode of the Curbsiders, bringing you a little knowledge food for your brain hole.
Yummy.
Yummy.
Oh, no to all of that. Get your show notes at thecurbsiders.com, and while you're there, sign up for our mailing list to get our weekly show notes in your inbox. Plus, twice each month, you'll get our new Curbsiders Digest, headed up by the amazing Nora Taranto, recapping the latest practice-changing articles, guidelines, and news in internal medicine.
We're committed to providing you with high-value, practice-changing knowledge, and we want your feedback, so please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts or now on Spotify. And you can also contact us at thecurbsiders@gmail.com. A reminder that this and most episodes are available for CME credit for all health professionals through VCU Health at curbsiders.vcuhealth.org. A special thanks to our whole Curbsiders team. Beth Garbitelli is our executive producer and runs our Twitter. Nora Taranto is the editor for the Digest. Maddie Mad Dog Morgan is on Instagram. Tima Karganov is on the website. Stuart Brigham composed our theme music. Claire Morgan of Notterly edits our audio. And finally, Chris the Chew Man Chew is on Facebook, or maybe Meta now, Paul. And until next time, I've been Dr. Matthew Frank Watto.
I've been Dr. Rahul Ganatra.
I've been Dr. Nora about Taranto.
And as always, our main Dr. Paul Nelson Williams. Thank you and goodbye.